Hello, Dr. Mason here again. Well, today we're going to talk a little bit about biology of things. One of the things that we typically think about when we talk about biology is we think about looking at things through a microscope. Well, today we're going to talk about how small is small. Well, you know, as the story goes, Socrates was lecturing to a group of students. Now, picture this classroom, Socrates lecturing in ancient Greece. A hillside overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. Green grass, blue water, no air pollution, no technology, very little mathematics, no cell phones, no science. All the students wearing togas, servants with wine, pouring things, laurel wreaths around everyone's head. Okay, you get the picture of what it would look like. Well, Socrates takes up a loaf of bread and divides it in half, gives half to one of his students, and asks her to pass it around to his students. Well, speaking of her, would it be a her? Probably not. In Socrates' days, it was probably just males that were in classrooms. Well, the students eat the bread, and then Socrates asks the students the question, how much bread do I have left? Well, all right, he broke it in half, so what's the answer? Half a loaf, right. Socrates then takes the half a loaf, breaks that loaf in half, asks the servant to pass it around to the students, repeats the question, how much bread do I have left? Well, again, the students look at him and respond, well, it's half of the half, or 1/4 of the bread is left. Again, he repeats the process and asks the same question. Again, the students respond. Half of 1/2 is a 4th, half of a 4th is an 1/8. If we split half of the 1/8, it's a 16th, and so on. Well, then Socrates pops the real question. If I continue to break the bread in half, will I ever run out of bread? Okay, class, what's the answer? Well, theoretically, we know the answer is no, he wouldn't run out of bread. If you break it in half, half will still be left. But practically, it makes sense that eventually the bread would get so small that when you break it, it wouldn't be bread anymore. It will be whatever makes up the bread. The flour, the water, the salt, the yeast, the heat. Well, when we break down the parts of something, they will eventually be broken down even further. For instance, flour to the water, earth, energy that went into growing the wheat, and so forth. So, what Socrates deduced, and not observed, did he? He deduced this, was that all matter could be broken down into units that were no longer visible, into the units of earth and water and wind or air and fire. Now we know these as the 4 Greek elements. Socrates called them atomos, meaning indivisible in Greek. But remember, Socrates didn't have the tools to observe atoms. He did not do science. He thought about the concepts. He didn't even observe the elements. Well, we know now that at least 3 of the Greek elements are not indivisible. The air is made up of many different gases. Water is made up of many different things. And earth is made up of many different things. These things we now call atomos. After the Greek atomos, we call them atoms, or the smallest units which retain the characteristics of matter. But in the last 100 years, we know there are even smaller units, things like protons and neutrons and electrons, and even smaller quarks and muons. As our tools get better, our understanding gets better. Remember, science isn't truth. Science changes. What we know now about atoms is very different than what we knew at the beginning of the last century. We now know that atoms are composed of smaller units, and those small units of even smaller units. Well, on the other side of the scale, we know that matter is arranged into molecules and compounds and bigger units of matter, planets and stars and solar systems and galaxies and the universe. All of these on the other end of the spectrum, bigger and bigger and bigger. Science begins to describe all things small and all things big. It isn't always right, and it is always changing. And as it changes, our perspective of who we are and how we fit into time and space changes as well. Thank you. See you next time.